The wind had teeth and it was biting winter into the bones of the land. It scoured the plains, a relentless predator that found every gap in her worn prairie dress, every thin spot in the grey scarf wrapped tight around her head and mouth. I felt its chill not as a sensation but as a presence, a weight that added itself to the 2 heavy sacks of coal, one in each hand, that pulled her shoulders toward the frozen earth. Behind her, a towering piece of luggage, a monstrous collection of everything her father deemed worthless enough to send with her, was strapped to her back, its leather straps digging into the thin fabric of her coat. The weight was a constant, burning reminder. A dowry of coal and cast-off linens for the man who would take his stupid daughter off his hands. The word still echoed, sharp and clear as the crack of ice on a pail of water. A burden. A mouth to feed that offered nothing in return. She crested a low, wind-blasted rise and saw it. The cabin was less a building and more a wound in the landscape, a dark scar of rough-hewn timber and sod hunkered down against the immense, crushing dome of the grey sky. It was exactly as the letter described, a place at the edge of nowhere for a man with nothing. Smoke, thin and pale, clawed its way from a stone chimney, the only sign of life in 100 miles of desolate, snow-dusted brown. This was it. The end of one misery and, she supposed, the beginning of another. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears froze on the cheek and offered no warmth. She just shifted the weight on her back, tightened her grip on the rough burlap sacks, and walked on, her boots crunching a lonely rhythm in the thin, brittle snow. The door opened before she reached it. The man who stood there was like his cabin, built of hard lines and weathered textures. He was tall, but seemed shorter for the way he held himself, a stillness that absorbed sound and motion. His face was a map of sun and wind, his eyes the color of the winter sky, holding a quiet, assessing depth. He wore simple, patched denim and a flannel shirt worn soft with use. He looked at the sacks of coal in her hands first, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Then his eyes lifted to her face, then to the precarious tower of luggage on her back. He said nothing. Silence was his greeting. Mai stopped a few feet from the threshold, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She held out the sacks of coal, an offering. Her father's final transaction. The man, Amos, as the letter had named him, finally moved. He stepped forward, his worn leather boots making no sound. He did not take the sacks. Instead, he reached behind her, his large, calloused hands finding the straps of the luggage. With a quiet grunt of effort, he unbuckled them and lifted the entire weight from her back. He set it down beside the door with a soft thud. Only then did he take the coal, his fingers brushing hers for a brief, startling moment. The touch was not rough, but firm, and carried a surprising, latent warmth. "Inside," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones shifting at the bottom of a dry creek bed. It was not a welcome. It was a simple, practical command. The inside of the cabin was a study in sparseness. A single room, a stone hearth where a small fire sulked, a rough table with 2 chairs, and a cot in the corner. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee. It was poor, undeniably so, but it was clean. Every object had its place, the few pans hanging by the fire were scrubbed, the floor swept clear of debris. It was the careful poverty of a man who respected what little he had. He placed the coal sacks near the hearth without a word, then turned to her. He gestured to the second cot, a simple frame with a thin mattress and a single, patched wool blanket folded neatly upon it. "That's yours." He moved to the fire, adding a few pieces of kindling. The flame stirred, licking at the new fuel, casting flickering shadows that made the small room seem both larger and more confining. Mai stood by the door, uncertain. She had been delivered, a piece of cargo. Now what? She watched him, his movements economical and sure. He did not look at her again. He was a man accustomed to solitude, and her presence was an intrusion he was enduring, not embracing. She finally moved, her limbs stiff with cold and exhaustion. She unbuttoned her thin coat, folded it carefully, and placed it at the foot of her cot. She did not know the rules of this place, but she knew the rules of survival. Make yourself useful. Make yourself small. She saw the water bucket near the door was half empty. Without a word, she picked it up, her eyes flicking to his for permission. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, his gaze fixed on the fire. She stepped back out into the biting wind, the empty bucket feeling impossibly light after the weight of the coal and luggage. The well was 50 yards away, its handle coated in a thin, treacherous layer of ice. The work had begun. This was her new life, a world of cold, of silence, and of the constant, watchful presence of the man named Amos. The day settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the cold. There were no wasted words, only work. Amos would rise before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards her alarm. He would be gone for hours, checking traps or tending to something unseen over the rise, returning with the silent tread of a ghost. During his absence, Mai worked. She hauled the water, split the kindling into finer pieces for the fire, mended his torn shirts with tiny, precise stitches that were a language of their own, and cooked the simple, repetitive meals of salted meat and beans. She learned the landscape of his poverty, the single cracked ceramic cup he drank his coffee from, the way he sharpened his knife on a worn whetstone until it could shave a head, which he rationed their meager supplies. He never thanked her. He never praised her. But he observed everything. He saw the way she banked the fire at night so the coals would last until morning. He saw how she used the dishwater to scrub the floor, wasting nothing. He noticed the neat pile of firewood she stacked by the door, each piece perfectly sized. One afternoon, he returned to find she had taken the worn-out burlap from the coal sacks, washed it in the freezing well water, and was stitching it into patches to reinforce the threadbare curtains against the incessant draft. He stopped in the doorway and watched her for a full minute, her head bent in concentration, her fingers moving with a deftness that belied their raw, chapped state. He said nothing, but that night, when they ate their stew in the usual silence, he pushed the small piece of hard bread from his plate over to hers. Mai looked at it, then up at him. His face was impassive, shadowed by the firelight. She gave a small nod of her own and ate the bread. It was the first gift he had given her. Their communication became a series of these silent gestures. He would leave a rabbit he'd snared on the table, she would have it skinned, cleaned, and simmering in the pot by the time he returned from his next task. She found a loose heel on his boot. The next morning, he found it repaired, the leather stitched together so tightly it was stronger than the original. One evening, a storm blew in, a blizzard that howled like a hungry wolf and threw sheets of snow against the cabin's single window. The wind found every crack, and the temperature inside plummeted. Mai shivered constantly, her thin blanket offering little protection. She did not complain. She simply pulled her cot closer to the hearth and wrapped her scarf tighter. In the middle of the night, she awoke, not from the cold, but from a new warmth. Amos was standing over her. He had taken the heavy, oiled canvas coat he wore in the worst weather and laid it over her blanket. He was just a dark shape against the dying embers of the fire. He thought she was asleep. He stood there for a long moment before returning to his own cot, leaving the weight and the warmth of his protection behind. Hidden among the worn tools by the door was a single, fine axe. Its hickory handle was smooth and perfectly balanced, its head forged of dark, patterned steel that seemed to drink the light. It was a beautiful, lethal thing, utterly out of place amongst the rusted saws and chipped implements. It was the one object in the cabin that did not speak of poverty. It spoke of quality, of pride, of a world beyond this desperate subsistence. Sometimes, when Amos was gone, Mai would run a finger along the polished handle, feeling the perfect grain of the wood. It was a secret, a contradiction she could not solve. It was a piece of him that did not fit the story he presented to the world. It hinted at a strength and a purpose that lay dormant, coiled and waiting, much like the man himself. The arrival of a horseman was an event. Sound carried far in the winter quiet, and they heard the rhythmic crunch of hooves on snow long before the rider appeared. Amos, who had been oiling a trap by the fire, went still. He stood and moved to the window, his body instantly tense. Mai watched his back, the sudden rigidity in his shoulders. Trouble had a sound, and this was it. The rider who came into view was a man built of swagger and expensive leather. He rode a fine, tall gelding and wore a thick coat with a beaver fur collar. He dismounted with an air of ownership, as if the very ground he stood on belonged to him. Hollister, Amos said, the name a flat, hard stone in the quiet room. He turned from the window and looked at Mai. Stay inside. Hollister did not bother to knock. He pushed the door open and filled the space with his bulk and his arrogance. His eyes, small and greedy, swept the cabin's interior, dismissing it with a sneer. Then they landed on my. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Well, now, Amos. I heard you'd acquired some new property. Didn't figure it'd be so exotic." He looked my up and down as if she were a horse he was considering buying. Amos moved to stand between them, a silent, immovable obstacle. His stillness was profound, a stark contrast to Hollister's restless energy. "What do you want, Hollister?" "Just a neighborly visit," the man said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "And to make you an offer. You're barely scratching a living out here. That little piece of land you're squatting on abuts my southern pasture. I'll give you a fair price for it. Enough to get you out of this territory." His gaze slid past Amos to Mai again. "And I'll take the girl off your hands. Pay you double what you gave for her." I'd wager the insult hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Mai felt a cold dread creep up her spine, colder than any winter wind. She was property. A thing to be bought and sold. Her father's valuation of her had followed her all the way to this desolate cabin. Amos did not move a muscle. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "She is not for sale," Hollister laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Don't be a fool. What use is she to you out here? I can give her a proper place. My house has rooms she could get lost in." "This is my land," Amos said, his voice dropping even lower. The words were not a claim, they were a fact. "And you are not welcome on it. Leave." Hollister's face darkened. He took a step forward, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. "You're in no position to give orders, squatter. This whole valley will be mine eventually. A stubborn pauper like you is just a temporary inconvenience." In that moment, Mai moved. She didn't think, she acted. She reached into the kindling box beside the hearth and her hand closed around a heavy piece of split oak. It was solid, rough, and real. She stood up and took a step to the side, so she was no longer behind Amos, but beside him. She held the wood low, not as a weapon to be brandished, but as a clear statement. She was not cowering. She was not waiting to be rescued. Her eyes met Hollister's, and for the first time, she did not look away. Her gaze was as steady and unyielding as the man who stood next to her. The arrogant smirk on Hollister's face faltered. He looked from Amos's stony expression to Mai's quiet defiance, and saw not two victims, but a united front. He saw something he hadn't expected and didn't understand. With a curse, he backed away, pulling the door open. "You'll regret this," he snarled, before mounting his horse and riding away, his anger churning the snow into a muddy mess. The silence he left behind was heavier than before. Amos stood for a long time, his back to her, looking out the open door at the tracks Hollister's horse had left. Finally, he closed it, the latch clicking shut with a sound of finality. He turned, and his eyes found the piece of wood still clutched in Mai's hand. He walked over to her, and for a moment, she thought he might be angry at her interference. Instead, he gently took the wood from her grasp and placed it back in the kindling box. He looked at her, and the impenetrable wall of his reserve seemed to crack, just for a second. A new light was in his eyes, not warmth, not yet, but a deep and profound respect. He had tested her with hardship, and she had endured. Hollister had tested them both with malice, and she had stood her ground. He gave a single, slow nod. It was more eloquent than any speech. The test was over. The next morning broke clear and cold, the world scrubbed clean by the storm. The sky was a pale, brilliant blue. After their silent breakfast, Amos stood and pulled on his heavy coat. He looked at her. Come, it wasn't a command to work, but an invitation. Mai put on her own thin coat and wrapped her scarf around her head, and followed him out into the blinding white of the new day. He didn't walk toward his trap lines or the well. He walked away from the cabin, heading for the high, windswept ridge that formed the western wall of their small hollow. The climb was steep, the snow deep in places. Amos broke the trail, his long legs moving with an easy, powerful rhythm. He never looked back to see if she was following. He knew she would be. They reached the summit as the morning sun cleared the distant mountains, flooding the landscape with golden light. Mai caught her breath, partly from the climb, partly from the cold air burning her lungs. Amos stood at the edge, looking out over what lay beyond. He waited for her to come and stand beside him. This was the threshold. She stepped up next to him, and the world fell away. Below them, stretching out as far as the eye could see, was not more desolate prairie, but a vast, sheltered valley. A river, a ribbon of dark, moving water, snaked through its center, its banks lined with cottonwood stark and beautiful against the snow. And scattered across the valley floor, grazing peacefully in the winter sun, were cattle. Not a dozen, not 100, but thousands. They were tiny specks of black and brown against the white, a sprawling testament to immense, hidden wealth. Nestled in a curve of the river was a ranch house, long and low-slung, built of dark timber and river stone, with corrals and barns fanning out from it like a small, self-contained town. Smoke rose from its chimneys, a confident plume against the blue sky. Mai stared, speechless. Her mind struggled to connect the scene of profound prosperity below with the man standing beside her, the man of the patched shirt and the cracked cup. It was impossible. He followed her gaze, his expression unreadable as ever. "My father built the house," he said, his voice quiet against the vastness. "My grandfather settled the valley. Hollister's land ends at that far ridge. He thinks this is all empty territory. He doesn't know what's behind this rise." He turned his gaze from the valley to her. "The cabin, it's a line shack. I use it in the winters. It's a quiet place. A good place to see what a person is made of when they think you have nothing to give them." He was not apologizing. He was explaining. He had received her father's letter, a cruel, dismissive note selling off a daughter he considered worthless. Amos had seen not a burden, but a chance. A chance to find someone who wasn't looking for wealth, because they didn't know it existed. He had built a fortress of poverty around himself to protect the quiet heart of his world, and he had invited her inside to see if she would tear it down or help him guard the walls. She understood. The hardship, the silence, the constant testing, it hadn't been cruelty. It had been a question. And her every action, the mended shirt, the saved bread, the defiant piece of firewood, had been her answer. She looked from the sprawling ranch below, a kingdom hidden in plain sight, back to his weathered face. The wind on the ridge was cold, but for the first time since she had arrived, she did not feel it. A different kind of warmth was spreading through her, a deep and steady heat that had nothing to do with a fire. He watched her, waiting. He had shown her his secret world. Now the choice was hers. She looked at the valley, a place of impossible beauty and scale. Then she looked at him, a man of impossible stillness and depth. She knew which one was real. She gave a single, slow nod, mirroring the one he had given her the day before. It was all the answer he needed. The walk down into the valley was a descent into a different world. The air grew stiller, the sun warmer. The scale of the operation became clearer with every step, the sturdy fences, the well-fed livestock, the sheer size of the main house. It was not a place of gaudy opulence, but one of quiet, solid substance. Inside, the house was just as he was. Simple, strong, and built to last. Polished wood floors, comfortable leather chairs worn soft with age, a massive stone fireplace that crackled with a welcoming blaze. It was a home, not just a shelter. He led her to the great room, the heart of the house. He unslung the small pack he always carried, the one that held his meager rations when he stayed at the line shack. From it, he pulled the single, cracked ceramic cup. He walked to the grand fireplace, its mantel a single, enormous beam of polished oak, and he placed the cup in the very center. It sat there, a humble, defiant piece of their shared history, a reminder of the world they had left behind on the ridge. He turned to her. The firelight played across his face, softening its hard lines. For the first time, he let his guard down completely, and she saw in his eyes not just respect, but a deep, quiet reverence. "My name is Amos Kane," he said, formally, as if they were meeting for the first time. "This is my home." He paused, and the air in the room was thick with all the words they had never spoken. "It is your home too, Mai. If you will have it, it was not a proposal of convenience, or a transaction, or an offer of charity. It was a statement of belonging. He was offering her not his wealth, but his world. His life. He was asking her to be the other pillar that held up this quiet kingdom. Mai looked at the man before her, at the cracked cup on the mantel, and at the fire burning steadily in the hearth. She slowly reached up and untied the grey scarf from her head, the one she had worn as armor against the cold and the cruelty of the world. She folded it carefully, her hand steady, and placed it on the table. A silent answer. A final, quiet acceptance. She was home.